Hey everybody, it's Professor Gugis, and I'm here to talk to you a little bit today about Chapter 6, Module 6. I should say Module 6, not Chapter 6. Anyway, we're here to talk about women and sports and the process of gatekeeping. And we're going to talk a little bit about this because it's really important. As we'll talk about at the end of this little lecture, sports aren't just sports. Sports are stories about how the world works and who, not just who is in charge, who sets the agenda and who makes the decisions, but who is capable of being in charge, who has leadership qualities, who has the abilities to successfully run a society. But first, gatekeeping. The four things we're going to talk about today are gatekeeping. We're going to talk about women in sports, and we're going to talk about their pay and how that's a function of economics. We're going to talk about preserving the stereotype, why sports plays a role in preserving our stereotypes, very traditional stereotypes of femininity. And then we'll talk about why does this matter? Why are we talking about sports as if there's something important? Okay. And I'll lead into our discussion with a brief anecdote, little story that helps illustrate why sports are so important. Okay, I don't even know how many ESPN channels there are now. Okay, but you can pretty much watch football, American football, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They'll show you old games. They'll show you college games. They'll show you high school games. They'll show you, if you have a good enough package, they'll show you games that haven't been played yet. Okay, that part's a joke. The fact, though, is simply this. From a very, very early age, one group of Americans, and we'll call that group of people males, okay, is immersed in sports culture. They are immersed in sports from a very early age. And on top of that, they are frequently immersed in sports culture alongside the most important, or one of the two most important authority or adult figures in their lives, which is typically the male in the house. Okay. I remember when I was very, very young, my father played on the softball league for his the company that he worked for. He worked for an insurance company. Okay. I remember him getting dressed to go play one night, and he came out of the bedroom where he'd gotten dressed, and the team's uniforms looked just like the Los Angeles Dodgers. And it was, for me, it was like seeing Superman. Okay, it was just the coolest thing I'd ever seen in my life. Now, I was very young, hadn't seen a whole lot, but you get the idea. Okay, think about whether or not you could, without looking it up, name at least one player on the Los Angeles Lakers and one player on the LA Clippers, and then, without looking it up, tell me if you can name your state assembly person. That's how important sports are. Sports are a frame through which we see the world. So, which sports do we see? And that brings us to the idea of gatekeeping. Gatekeeping is a very simple idea. There's a whole lot of news, a whole lot of sports, a whole lot of texts, and somebody decides which ones we have the opportunity to see. Okay? Now, when it comes to gatekeeping and sports, yes, you can watch via YouTube or various other video outlets any sport you want from anywhere in the world. The question is, which ones are you most likely to watch? Which ones are you most likely to know anything about? Excuse me. And which ones do you have easiest access to? Okay. If you knew nothing about sports, you sat down in front of your television or you sat down in front of your computer and started doing just a little reading, a little looking for videos. Okay. Which are you more likely to run across? American football or one of my favorite sports, curling. And if you don't know what curling is, look it up. It's great. You look at it for 5 minutes, you go like, how did this become a sport? Okay. Obviously, you're going to see American football. Big money, big corporations, have a very vested interest in you paying attention to the existing and established sports in the United States culture, right? So there's a lot of money spent on promoting those sports, to putting those in front of you and to getting your attention. Okay? If you look at television news coverage of sports, about 72% of all television coverage devoted to sports in the United States is devoted to football, basketball, and baseball. Okay, 72%. Why? Because the systems that make money off of those sports don't want you to find out that rugby is interesting, or Formula One can be a lot of fun to watch, or skiing, downhill skiing is a fascinating sport to watch, because that's sort of like letting your boyfriend or girlfriend go out with somebody else. You don't want, if you're involved in football, you don't want a potential audience member to go find another sport to hang out with. So, while it's not strictly gatekeeping, okay, we do have access to pretty much any sport that we care to watch, to expose ourselves to. We still have the issue of which ones do we find out about? Which sports are we exposed to on a regular basis? And that's where big media companies help promote the sports that do the best job of gathering an established audience. In other words, to perpetuate their interest in something that they're already interested in. So that's kind of how, I'm going to call that soft gatekeeping. It's not saying you can't look at that or we're not going to show you that. It's a lot of money and a lot of effort devoted to saying, hey, look at this thing. And that's where we're at right now. Okay? Now, again, so it's sports. Well, sports are important. There's important storytellers in our culture. Okay? So we talk a lot about women in sports and the pay gap in between the two. Okay? So we have to understand that there's a reason for this, and it has absolutely nothing to do with the relative ability or skills or type of game that are played by sports that are still divided up by sex. Okay? Think about this. If for the past 20 years of your life, you had watched nothing but WNBA, okay? All basketball played by female athletes. Okay? And then somebody showed you a game played by male athletes, you'd look at it and go, what's wrong with them? Why can't they shoot from the outside? Why are they elbowing each other in the head under the basket? It would look very unusual to you. Okay? The male version, the male iteration of most sports is simply the one that we are used to most, and so therefore that becomes the way that we define normal. Okay? So when we look at the popularity of a particular gendered sport, the particular sex breakdown in sports, the male version versus the female version, right? You look at a culture where men are taught that they're supposed to know something about sports, and if they don't, there's something wrong with them. Okay? And then you look at the actual narrative, which is predominantly men engaging in those sports, and you combine the two and you wind up with larger audiences of men watching the sports than you see audiences of women. So therefore, okay, if the function of an athlete is essentially this function of an entertainer, to gather an audience, okay, then male athletes are going to be paid more because they simply draw a bigger audience to sell to advertisers. If you are advertising something to a predominantly male audience, let's say, oh, I don't know, beer. Beer is predominantly purchased by males in the United States. Okay? If you're advertising beer, okay, you're going to want to reach the largest male audience possible. If male sports attract a bigger male audience, then you're going to pay more for that ad. And the male athletes are simply paid more because they draw a bigger audience. And that bigger audience is something that is of greater value. That's all it comes down to. That's the only reason that male athletes make more money than female athletes. They draw a bigger audience. If tomorrow, the WNBA doubled the audience sizes of the NBA, okay, we would see a commensurate increase in the salaries of the athletes in the WNBA because they would be participating, they would be helping to deliver a much larger audience to the people who advertise in WNBA games. All right, so having said that, we want to move on to the third item that we want to talk about tonight, wherever it is in your time. And that's preserving the stereotype. Okay? There's a secondary idea that goes along with sports, and it's one that I call preserving the stereotype. Okay? What we find, one of the interesting things that we find about stereotypes, we'll talk about it in pornography, we'll talk about it in our representation of Latinx people, is this idea that the stereotypes tend to remain consistent over various different platforms. The stereotypes about African American males, for example, exist in sports, they exist in movies, they exist in music. And it's the same basic stereotype. If the stereotype is consistent and repeated, it is a useful communication tool. It's like a well-defined, clearly outlined word. Everybody knows what it means. Okay? So we're a little hesitant. We're a little hesitant to challenge stereotypes in the world of sports, especially because, gender stereotypes in the world of sports, especially because the thing that makes you successful in sports is exactly the thing that makes you unsuccessful in terms of our traditional roles of femininity. Sports is the world of aggression, power, domination of your opponent. Those are the opposite qualities that you see when you look at the stereotypes of femininity in our culture. So we have to be really careful in the world of sports to present stereotypes, female athletes, if you will, in a way that doesn't challenge the stereotype too much. Let me give you an example. My personal opinion, I don't watch boxing, I don't watch MMA. Watching two people attempt to give each other traumatic brain injury is not my idea of sport. But if you look at the female athletes who participate in MMA and Ultimate Fighting Championship, that sort of thing, take a look at them and ask yourself, do they adhere to or deviate from our existing standards of beauty when it comes to women? Okay? Hey, you're going to go into a ring and fight with somebody. First thing I'd do, shave my hair off. They can't grab it, they can't pull it, doesn't get snagged, right? You see any women in the ring in MMA who've got shaved heads. Okay? Most of them look like actresses, and quite frankly, a lot of them have second careers as actresses. That's how they work in that world and still manage to preserve the stereotype. One of the key ideas of women is that they are valued for their appearance. If you really want to know, if you really want another illustration of this idea, okay, just use your academic scale of hotness that we've talked about, okay? Rate them on a scale of 1 to 10. A 10 is somebody that you would pretty much empty out your bank account and the bank accounts of other people who aren't looking in order to date them. And a 1 is somebody you'd rather chew your own arm off than go out on a date with them. Ask yourself where the male athletes who do MMA fall on that 1 to 10 scale. And then ask yourself where the female athletes who do MMA fall on that scale. The emphasis on the female athletes adhering to our existing standards of beauty is a way that we preserve the idea, the stereotype, if you will, that a woman is valued for the way that she looks. That brings us to our last point. Sports are stories about the way the world works. Okay? As I alluded to earlier, sports are contests of power, intelligence, determination, aggression. Okay? When we look at the characteristics, those characteristics separate from the sport, we also notice that those characteristics would be very well suited for somebody who is, I don't know, say a president, police chief, head of the medical staff at a hospital, um, CEO of a major car company. In other words, sports teaches us that one group of people, predominantly men, have the characteristics required to be the leaders and the standard setters of our society. That's why sports is important. It's not just about who won the Super Bowl. It's the fact that there's nothing but men out there performing that particular contest and the lessons that we learn about how the world works. So what I wanted to talk about, like I said, was women in sports. We've talked about gatekeeping, which sports are presented to you. We've talked about the function of the athlete as entertainer, and that explaining the gap in pay between male athletes and female athletes. We've talked about how sports, even though it might not be something we traditionally associate with femininity, still help to preserve the stereotypes about femininity. And we've talked about why sports are important, because they teach us that one group of people has the qualities associated with leadership. I'm Professor Gugis, and thank you for your time.